All right, friends. Well, let me just get my stuff together here. All right, so don't get intimidated by all the dates. That's mostly for me and to make sure I don't get lost, but which happens sometimes. But it is relevant. A lot of times when we are looking at, kind of religious history, history of Christian traditions, sometimes we're tempted to kind of separate or divorce the history of our Christian tradition from the history of kind of everything that's going on around it. Does that make sense? So it's tempting to kind of trace the family tree, trace the line of, let's say, the Baptist tradition, and pretending like the rest of the world doesn't exist. And you can do that, but it's not super helpful because it doesn't tell you a lot of whys, right? So why certain things happened, why certain confessions took place, why Baptists grew and multiplied in some places but didn't grow in other places, these sorts of things, right? The history that's going on around the Baptist tradition impacts that story. Does that make sense? I mean, we can think about it in our own family trees. It's very similar, right? So again, if you look at my family tree, for instance, as gnarled as it may be at some places, I have a paternal ancestor who, served during the Civil War, my family's from Georgia, so obviously we were in the Confederacy neck of the woods, and had a paternal ancestor who was actually on General Lee's staff, was there at the surrender at Appomattox, and you can just kind of tell that story and you can trace through, but one of the things that you kind of need to know in tracing through my own family tree is that paternal ancestor who was there at Appomattox, he was one of 4 brothers. And his other 3 brothers were all killed in various engagements at various points during the Civil War, right? So you could, if you were just looking at the family tree, if you were just looking at the lineage, it would look odd that all of a sudden there are 4 brothers and then all of a sudden there's just one. What happened, right? Well, you need that outside history to kind of know and to explain. So similarly, we're going to look at a little bit of outside history as we talk about the story of British Baptists generally, but English Baptists most particularly. So if you remember last time, we talked about 3 different kind of origin stories for Baptists. You have the kind of Anabaptist descent, where Baptists kind of originated out of the Radical Reformation, influenced primarily by continental Anabaptists, the predecessors to like Mennonites and the Amish and these sorts of things. So is that kind of part of our family tree? We looked also at English separatist descent, which is kind of what we're going to look at a little more specifically this evening. And we talked about landmarkism, that, actually, if you get real creative with some history and with some theological lines, you can actually trace Baptists all the way back to the New Testament church. But regardless of which of those origin stories you kind of buy into, at the end of the day, the Baptist story really, at least modern Baptists, really begin in England. And they begin in England roughly kind of towards the end of the 1500s, and really the birth of the movement beyond just a handful of churches really hits its stride during the 1600s, specifically in England, right? So we need to know a little bit about English history, a little bit particularly about the English Reformation, again, as we kind of talked about earlier, to understand the soil in which British Baptists are kind of growing up in, okay? So a couple points that we talked about from last week, just to remember, we narrowed down and we targeted kind of 1611, right? So 1611 as a key date that we're looking at. because 1611 is when Helwys begins. He's leaving Amsterdam. You've got that first kind of Baptistic congregation in Holland, in Amsterdam, under John Smythe and Thomas Helwys. Smythe just after a few months, really, kind of diverges from, he goes, commits himself to believers' baptism, commits his church to believers' baptism, but then begins to kind of actually follow in that Anabaptist trajectory, becoming more in line with the Vaterlander Mennonites, the Mennonites that they were kind of, that church was kind of sharing a property with. Smythe kind of goes on a different theological trajectory, but Helwys maintains the seed, the kernel of what eventually will bloom and blossom into the Baptist tradition. And Helwys returns in 1611 back to England, just outside of London, to Spatial Field, right? So that Spatial Field congregation in 1611. Now, when Helwys returns, right, we have to ask a couple questions. So if we're gonna zone in on this congregation, this Spatial Field congregation, 1611, and if we have to kind of stick our thumb somewhere, this is as good a place to any as to talk about the first Baptist church, right? The first distinctly Baptist congregation. If we're gonna kind of put our thumb somewhere, it's here in England, Spatial Field, 1611. Now, a couple questions we have to ask around this. One thing I really didn't address last time, because I was kind of saving it for tonight, was, well, why did Smythe and Helwys leave England to begin with? Right? We talked about how they left. They were exiled in some sense to Holland. And when Helwys returns to England, he does so knowing that his church is coming into England under persecution, that they are being persecuted for their faith. Not their Christianity so much as their belief in a separate, distinct, independent local church, and especially their belief in believers' baptism. So they left England under the threat of persecution. Helwys, in this congregation returning in 1611, is returning to an England under persecution, and that persecution is not by Roman Catholics. Remember our very first meeting, right? We talked about how the Reformation breaks out and persecution comes across Europe to these early Reformation Christians, whether we're talking about the Lutheran tradition, the Reformed tradition, the Radical tradition. They all come under some varying degrees of persecution by the dominant majority Roman Catholicism throughout Europe at that time. But even as that first generation of Reformation begins to take root and wins, quote unquote, in some places, particularly what we think of today as Germany, the modern German states, areas around Switzerland, Geneva, and my brain just hiccuped. Geneva and somewhere else in Switzerland, right? Calvin and Zwingli, they're establishing there in Swiss area. You have Lutheranism spreading kind of in Northern Europe, particularly in the Nordic countries like Denmark and Sweden. You have Anabaptism never really digs in deep roots, but it's pretty common where there's some level of religious liberty, like in Holland, like in Amsterdam, these places. But in England, the Reformation takes a little bit of a different turn. So to understand why Smythe and Helwys are under persecution to leave England, and when Helwys comes back to England, they're still under persecution, I need to tell a little bit of the story of the Reformation in England. Does that make sense? All right? Because, again, Helwys and these early Baptists are being persecuted by other Protestants. they're being persecuted not by Roman Catholics, but by other Protestants. Okay, so why? Well, the story of the English Reformation is amazingly, fantastically complicated. I love it. It's one of my favorite little pieces of church history. But I'm going to try to give you the Reader's Digest version in about 10 minutes. So hold on, right? So the English Reformation, the story of the English Reformation begins with Henry VIII. Now, why do we, many of you probably already know about Henry VIII. Raise your hand if you've heard of this guy before. Henry VIII, what is he famous for? Killed all of his wives, right? All the wives of Henry VIII, exactly, right? That's what he's famous for, and rightfully so. He went through a lot of them, killing most of them, right? So the story of Henry VIII is marked as the beginning of the English Reformation, because essentially what happens is Henry VIII becomes king, and one of the things when you become king, you think you inherit. What are some things you inherit? You inherit like your crown, and your scepter, and the jewels, and a kingdom. One of the things that Henry inherits is a wife, right? So his older brother was king for just like a month, not very long. He got sick and he dies. He was essentially engaged to be married to Catherine of Aragon. She was a Spanish princess, right? So when Henry's brother dies, Henry becomes king, he takes on that engagement, essentially. He takes on his brother's wife. They're married, and that's Henry's first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Now, Henry, at this point, is a staunch Roman Catholic, right? There's no kind of questioning his kind of traditional Catholic credentials, right? He even writes when Luther begins writing. So Luther's ministry is kind of like halfway through Henry's reign. When Luther begins writing, Henry actually writes kind of a theological treatise, right? A little theological pamphlet and book decrying the heresies of Luther and Lutheranism. And the Pope at the time loved it so much that he bestowed upon Henry the title Defender of the Faith. And that title actually still exists even today, attached to the now British monarchy. So when Charles III, who was just coronated recently, Charles III is coronated, he one of his many, many titles is Defender of the Faith. That goes all the way back to Henry VIII. Now the irony of that is Charles III today wears that title as a Protestant, more or less, right? But the title is granted by a Catholic pope back in the 16th century, right? Now, Henry's happy, powerful, young, right? Has a beautiful bride, a little bit older than he is, but still kind of in her prime. And they go about the business of what you do when you're a monarchical couple, and that's to ensure the stability of the line, right? You need babies, and not just any babies. You need male babies, right? You need boys. And so Catherine of Aragon has children. Many of them die either in pregnancy or in childbirth, right? She has two that live, and that's first Mary and then eventually Elizabeth. As you can tell by the names, both female, right? That does Henry, in his mind, zero good. So Henry begins to develop a relationship with another woman, Anne Boleyn. Long story short, Anne Boleyn provides a mechanism by which Henry believes he can produce a male heir. And so what Henry wants is an annulment. Now, a lot of people say he wants a divorce. He doesn't want a divorce. Divorce in Roman Catholic theology is a cardinal sin. Even the Pope can't really kind of undo it, but the Pope can say it's an annulment, like the marriage never existed, right? So he tries to go to the Pope. He goes to the Pope and says, I need an annulment for my marriage with Catherine. Can you pull this off? The Pope says no. The reason the Pope says no, and this is a lot of detail, but I think it's kind of funny. The reason the Pope says no, because again, Henry VIII, what is he? He's the defender of the faith, right? He's on the Pope's good side. But this time, the Pope says no. And the reason the Pope says no is because the Pope is currently under house arrest, And the Pope is under house arrest by Charles, the Holy Roman Emperor, who also happens to be Catherine of Aragon's nephew. Right? So it's, again, complicated. Whoa, what a tangle web we weave. Right? So Pope is under house arrest. He's not going to grant this annulment. Pope basically just says you're going to have to deal with it. Henry is not happy. Now, the whole time you have this figure of Anne Boleyn. She's kind of functioning as a sort of mistress at this point. Anne Boleyn is a Protestant, right? She and her family have left secretly. It's not public because Catholicism at this point is still kind of the official state church of England. You will get burned alive by Thomas More, one of the main counselors of Henry VIII at this point, if you publicly were found out to be a Protestant. But Anne Boleyn, her family, others that are connected to her household are all Protestants, and they begin kind of influencing Henry to one degree or to another, right? Long story short, Henry essentially comes to the conclusion, well, the problem here is the Pope, right? Problem here is the Pope. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to create a new church, right? So he's kind of hearing some of the things Anne Boleyn and her counselors are saying, the Reformation, the evils of the papacy and the Pope and all these other sorts of things. No problem. We're going to create a new church. We're going to call it, eventually it's going to be called the Church of England, right? England needs its own church. Now, here's what a lot of people get mixed up. Does the Reformation start with this point? Kind of. Because what Henry's doing here is what Henry divorces himself from the authority of the Pope, yes, but Henry's still Roman Catholic in the sense of still maintaining all of that economy of salvation, right? Henry still believes in saints. He still believes in indulgences and the need of the sacrament, salvation through the sacrament, these sorts of things, right? But what Henry does is he breaks from Rome, okay? Now, without going into a lot of story, Henry goes through Anne Boleyn. He sends Catherine of Aragon off to a convent, along with her daughters are separated from her. Her daughters functionally go under, Mary and Elizabeth essentially go under a sort of house arrest separately. And then eventually Anne Boleyn herself produces a male heir, produces a son, Edward. But Anne Boleyn is accused, depending on how you look at it, depending on which historical evidence you prioritize, maybe credibly, maybe not credibly, but Anne Boleyn is eventually executed. And so Henry goes through this kind of string of wives until finally he gets kind of to the end of his life. Over time, many, if not really almost all of his succeeding wives are varying degrees of Protestant, varying degrees of even evangelical, some of them, right? And so they are kind of influencing him to the point where towards the end of his life, he has a Archbishop of Canterbury. It's kind of the head of the priestly head of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer. He is a Protestant in every way. And so you see that by the time we get to the end of Henry's life, even Henry himself, though we may not classify him as a Protestant, all of the mechanisms of the Church of England, and much of even the theology begins to shift and subtly change during his life until he dies. And then his son, Edward VI, becomes king. Now, Edward VI becomes king, and Edward, again, son of Anne Boleyn, he's raised by Protestant tutors. He's raised by Protestant counselors. And so when he becomes king, he's got a minority council, essentially a group of people that kind of help steward him and his reign. And it's under Edward that really the Reformation hits England, right? You could think of it almost like a faucet. And kind of halfway to the end, once you hit Anne Boleyn, to the end of Henry's reign, the Reformation just kind of dripped, drip, drip, drip. And then when Henry dies and Edward becomes king, that faucet goes on full blast, right? It goes on full blast. The theology, the official kind of doctrine, theology of the church radically changes. It becomes Protestant, kind of more in the Reformed, of those three branches, kind of more in the Reformed branch than really anything else. All of the priests have to kind of forego any kind of fealty outside of England. They were already kind of had to do that under Henry VIII. Another thing Henry VIII had already done, Henry VIII had kind of seized all the monasteries and a lot of church property. Under Edward, the doctrine, the theology had changed. And so priests could now marry publicly under Edward VIII. Cranmer had already been married for I think the last 5 to 8 years of even Henry VIII's reign. It was kind of like the worst secret kept, But the Reformation goes into high gear by Edward VI. What few kind of traditional Roman Catholic priests and churches remained were essentially outlawed. Priests were that wouldn't kind of refuse allegiance to the Vatican and refuse allegiance to Rome. They were booted and exiled from England. It's Edward's reign where kind of the real English Reformation really kicks into gear. Now, problem. Now, if you notice these dates, one of the reasons I have them up here so you can kind of have a sense of how long they reigned. This is not how long they were alive. This is how long that they reigned. There's a little R here, right? So if you can just kind of do some basic math here, Edward is 6 years. He's king. And for those 6 years, the Protestant Reformation in England was in high gear. But Edward was born kind of sickly, and he grew up kind of sickly, and he died relatively young, right? He dies, I think, about 16, right? Dies very young. So the Reformation had been going in high gear, massive amounts of change in a relatively short period of time. Now, no more male heirs. So what happens at that point, the next suitable heir, and to them at the time, suitable is stretching it a bit, is Henry's oldest daughter, right? So Henry's oldest daughter, Mary, becomes queen. Now, Mary, like her mother, and let me backtrack something. I just realized I misstated something. Mary was Henry's and Catherine of Aragon's only daughter together. Elizabeth is actually the daughter of one of Henry VIII's other wives, not Anne Boleyn, but one of the other ones. I got that mixed up. That's right, thank you. And so Mary comes to the throne. Now Mary is basically like her mother. She's like her mother in that she is a stout, devout Roman Catholic, like Spanish Roman Catholic, which like the Spanish Inquisition, like massively Roman Catholic, not kind of like borderline, but uber Roman Catholic, right? Mary comes to the throne, and Mary, not hypothetically, but literally sets fire to the Protestant Reformation in England, begins rounding up Protestants, pastors, academics, theologians, lay leaders. She switches kind of everything. She essentially wants to rewind everything back to 1509. She swears fealty back to the Pope. Technically speaking, she gives England to the Pope, right? Like it's almost like a full reversal. Thomas Cranmer, who had been the Archbishop of Canterbury, remember, led in the Reformation under Edward VI, he's burned alive in the middle of Oxford, the university, right? These sorts of things happen, which is why to today she has the moniker Bloody Mary, right? So you've heard that title. That's who we're talking about here, Bloody Mary, okay? Now, Mary, her reign, obviously not that long either, about 5 years. 5 years of terror and blood, but relatively short, thankfully, right? So then Elizabeth comes to the throne. Now, Elizabeth, she has seen the destruction of her sister and even the uncertainty from her brother, and she tries to find a third way between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism, a via media, a third way, right? And so Elizabeth sets up kind of the modern Church of England, theologically, structurally. I'm not going to go into all the detail, but it's what Elizabeth and others kind of working for attempt to do is set up a new status quo in England, right? So there's a formalized prayer book. There's a formalized prescription of what it is to be a priest or a pastor. There's formalized theology. It's like you don't have the sacramentalism of Roman Catholicism, but you have like the order and the hierarchy and many of the traditions of Roman Catholicism. She's trying to kind of create the best of both worlds in many ways, okay? And during her reign, the Act of Supremacy is passed. And the Act of Supremacy basically says that any church that doesn't follow the Book of Common Prayer, the legal prescribed, it's more than just a prayer book, it's almost like a mandated order of service in some ways. Any church that doesn't follow the Book of Common Prayer is immediately illegal, right? And any pastor that leads a service against or in contrary to the Book of Common Prayer is essentially either fined, imprisoned, exiled, these sorts of things, okay? Now, Elizabeth reigns long. During Elizabeth's reign, that unity that she tried to achieve with the Act of Supremacy, that unity that she tries to achieve begins to break apart. Because even within the Church of England, you have groups that begin to develop that they like the church, there's always kind of the Roman Catholic in the background. It never really kind of goes away. But even within the Church of England, you have those that they like the new normal, they like the stability, they want to follow the rules, they want to follow the law, right? They like this third way, this in-between Catholicism and Protestantism. But then you have others within the Church of England, you have groups that want to change the church, particularly by the time we get to the end of Elizabeth's reign and into James the First's reign. You have this group that comes up within the church. They don't want to separate from the church, but they want to reform the church from within, the Church of England. They want to reform it from within. They want to purify it. And that's where we get the term Puritan. If you've ever heard the term Puritan, these are the Puritans. Puritans begin within the Church of England wanting to change the Church of England. And by change, what they mean is they want it to become full Protestant. And specifically, they want it to become full, kind of within the Reformed strain. They want it to look like Calvin's Geneva. They want it to look, really what they want it to look like is Scotland and the Presbyterian Puritan congregations in Scotland. They want to reform and change the church from within. They want to reform the way worship is done. They want to reform the way preaching is done. They want to reform everything. They want to purify it, hence, again, Puritans. But then you have others, what we call separatists, that want to they see the Church of England, they've compromised the gospel, they've compromised the Bible, and they want to break away from the church completely. They just wipe their hands and be done and go do their own thing, okay? That separatist tradition, that is where, now back to where we began, that's where Smythe comes from. Smythe is part of that separatist tradition. So when he's leaving, he and his church, Smythe and Helwys, when Smythe and Helwys are leaving their church, or leaving England with their church to Holland, to Amsterdam, they're part of that separatist tradition. They want a complete break with the Church of England because they've seen it as they see it as apostate. They see it as not a true church because they've compromised the gospel. So, and they've also basically get kicked out because that act of uniformity is still going on. Does that make sense? So, Helwys, 1611, Helwys comes back to England, okay, and begins this church in Spatialfield. And churches grow and continue to grow. New churches are started. New churches are started sometimes on purpose. Sometimes new churches are started on accident because their pastors are imprisoned and they die in prison. That's what happens to Helwes, right? Helwes actually writes the first, I mentioned this last time, the first Baptist confession in English. Helwes also writes the first, this is a separate document, he writes a letter. You talk about gumption, right? Helwes is part of an illegal church. He's an illegal pastor. And Helwes writes a letter to James. Like not an anonymous blog post. Right? He writes a letter to the king that says, no. What the Bible calls for is religious liberty. The state cannot coerce faith. And he's literally talking to James I, the King of England, who, by the way, ever since Edward VIII, the king, the monarch, is the head of the Church of England. Right? The head of the nation and the head of the church are the same in the Church of England setup. So he's writing a letter to James, who is also technically the head of the Church of England, and says, you can't coerce faith. You can't make people believe things, particularly and contrary to the Bible. Right? Spoiler alert, James goes to prison. and not James, Helwes. Helwes goes to prison and dies in prison. About 2 years later, his wife is also imprisoned, and his wife dies in prison. But despite all this, Baptists grow. They grow with some direct connection to this spatial field church in and around London, right? And a stream of Baptist churches begin to pop up across London, begin to pop up across southeast England at this point. Okay? Everybody following me so far? All right. Now, at roughly the same time, you have other Baptist congregations begin to develop and grow and populate across Middle England, Northern England, and in other parts of England as well, kind of outside of London, that are not direct genetic connections of spatial field. Okay? Now, whereas Helwes, spatial field, and many of the churches that come after them, they're kind of allergic. This may be a bad analogy, but that's what I have. They're kind of allergic to the Church of England in a lot of ways. They're allergic to kind of a lot of the formal tradition, the formal training, some of the formal doctrine. Again, they're coming out of this separatist group. They're not like the Puritans that want to kind of fix it from the inside. They don't want anything to do with it. Now, this second order, this second group of Baptists that begin to grow and develop simultaneously with this Helwes strain, they are a little more comfortable with the Church of England. And not really the Church of England, but they're a little more comfortable with the Puritans. Many of them are ex-Puritans. Many of them are Puritans who they reject much of what the Church of England teaches. They wanted to stay within the Church of England, but eventually they theologically kind of crossed that Rubicon. They crossed that bridge of believers' baptism, and they're like, well, we can't stay with that for sure. And then they begin to form their own churches, and they begin to form what we would identify later as Baptist congregations. So, two groups. This is what I'm trying to illustrate here in a very simplified way. Two groups of Baptists grow and develop simultaneously in England. One from Helwes and the Spatial Field congregation, another further north from a different group, this early kind of JLJ church. I'm not going to get into the details, but this other church that's a little more Puritan-esque, a little more influenced, coming out of the Puritan strain and not as much out of the separatist strain. And so what happens is, think of it like twins, not identical twins, right? but what's the fraternal twins? Is that what they're called, Rebecca? Yeah. So not identical twins, but fraternal twins. They're born of the same theological genetics. They're born of the same environment and conditions of persecution, but one has black hair and one has red hair, right? One has blue eyes, one has green eyes. They have the same genes, they just kind of flesh out in a little different ways. And that takes us to the two main streams of Baptists in England, and that's the general and particular Baptists. This is what historians will eventually kind of label them. Okay? So everybody following me up to this point. You've got two brothers of Baptists operating in England by the time we get to the 1600s. Two related, very, very close groups, ecclesiologically and Baptist distinctives, and we'll talk about that probably at the beginning of next session. But two very close, sharing the same theological genetics, but certain things kind of flesh out differently. And a lot of that has to do with the some of the early influences, whether they're influenced more by the separatist tradition or by the Puritan tradition. Now, so what is the difference? Okay, so I've got like 5 minutes. Let me see if in terms of ecclesiology, doctrine of the church, the things that make Baptists Baptists, like believers' baptism, right? Independent local congregations, right? Two offices, pastor, elder, and deacon, right? Religious liberty, all the things you can. We're going to talk about the Baptist acrostic at the beginning of next class, because a part of identifying Baptists is you kind of have to know what a Baptist is. But they share all those genetic markers, okay? But where they differ, because of their connection to either separatism or Puritanism, where they differ is primarily in the doctrine of the theology of atonement, and basically how does Jesus save people, right? That's primarily where they're different, and that's where the titles actually come from. So general Baptists, those that came from Hellwest and Spatialfield, general Baptists, they typically would hold to general or universal atonement, which basically means, you think about it, Jesus died for everyone, literally. Like Jesus died specifically for all humans in all times and all places, and when we repent and believe, the effects of that salvation are then applied to us. Does that make sense? Now, it doesn't mean that everyone is saved. That's universalism, that's a heresy, that's a whole other ballgame, right? But general atonement essentially says that Jesus died for everyone. And when we repent and believe, the effects of that atonement are then applied to us. Everybody following me so far? Okay. Particular Baptists, because they're a little more closely connected to English Puritanism, and because English Puritanism is more connected with the Reformed tradition and John Calvin and these sorts of things, particular Baptists believed in particular atonement. In other words, Jesus died for those whom he saved. Right? Jesus died for the elect, is probably what you've heard before, right? So Jesus died for the elect. Yes, sir? That's correct. It's the exact same thing. You may have heard the term limited atonement, right? Particular atonement's another way of saying it. It's Jesus died for a particular group. Now, obviously we don't have time to get into the merits of one or the other, but that's one of the big differences. There are some other differences. Again, particular Baptists are a little more comfortable with some of the covenantal theology from the Puritan influences, whereas generals don't. But in essence, a doctrine of salvation is really kind of what it boils down to. Now, having said that, I will say, particularly once we get to the end of the 1600s and into the 1700s, particular Baptists and general Baptists General Baptists and particular Baptists, they still, they didn't anathematize one another, right? They didn't hate one another. They didn't reject one another. They were both being hunted, right? They shared the things that united them were far more numerous than the things that divided them. There were just practicalities of not necessarily being in the same congregation, though what we're going to see next week as we go into later British history and even in American Baptist history, eventually what happens is both of these streams kind of flow back together into the Baptist tradition, right? Especially here in America, but even in England. So that kind of gets us, and I'm out of time, so we're going to have to spill this over into next week's discussion a little bit. But this kind of gets us to these early confessions. So General Baptists, their first confession is what's called the Orthodox Creed, 1679. Particular Baptists, their earliest creed is a little earlier, 1644. They'll eventually publish what's known as the Second London Baptist Confession in 1677. They republish it in 1689. The 1689 version is kind of what most people think of today. And if you look at the timeline over here, both of these confessions happen after the First London Baptist Confession happens up here during the reign of Charles I. But the Second London Baptist Confession and the Orthodox Creed happen after this period called the Commonwealth. Basically, this is the English Civil War, right? The monarchy is reestablished with Charles II, and so one of the reasons you have the 1677 and then the 1679 confessions is the Baptists are trying to re-explain themselves to Charles, because a lot of Baptists were on the side of Oliver Cromwell. They were on the side of the Commonwealth during the Civil War, and so they have to make sure another persecution doesn't pop up. So anyway, so this kind of gets us to these two streams in British Baptist life, general, particular Baptist. Next week, I'm going to show you kind of what happens to these two streams during the 1700s, particularly, right? They kind of go on their own trajectory. A lot of you may, why are there so many more Baptists in America than in England? I'm going to kind of explain that next week. But eventually what happens is they kind of merge eventually back together, and we see something similar in America. But this at least gets us to kind of towards the end of the 1600s, and you have these two streams develop. The big thing I want you to see, though, is that these two streams are brothers. They come from the same theological DNA, from the same theological trajectory. They're popping up at the same time, and they're both popping up within the context of the English Reformation. And what that does is that kind of helps sets us up for some of the things we're going to talk about next week, okay? All right, I know that was a lot, and I spent a little bit more time on the left side of the board than I intended to. I was hoping to get a little further over here than I did, but we'll catch up next week. But at this point, any questions?